I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, Michael Powell, former Times reporter, now Atlantic Monthly staff writer, joins us to explain how things went all wrong for Mayor Adams. But first, New York City's mental health crisis. Too often these days, we're reminded that a lack of city resources can often result in violence on our city streets and subways. It's a problem also mirrored in the city's jail population. Joining us with a recently released report on the changing demographics of incarceration is New York City Independent Budget Office analyst Arden Armbruster. And connecting with us from the New York Times is Metro journalist Jan Ransom. And welcome to you both. Jan, so many people in New York City jails now are encumbered with mental health problems. Are they getting any of the services that they really need?
Right. I think the short answer is that not enough people are. The city created these units called PACE, and these are supposed to be units that provide intensive psychiatric services, but there's only about 980 of these, and half of the jail population, which is about 3,000 men and women, have a diagnosed mental illness. A fifth of the population have a serious mental illness. So I think the short of the answer is no, not to mention that, the jails are still struggling with the same problems that intensified immediately after the pandemic, where, don't have enough officers, officers are not showing up to work, people are not getting the supervision that they should. People are self-harming, and we've had, dozens of detainees actually either harm themselves in a way that was fatal, overdose on drugs, and about a lot of those people were folks who were suffering from mental illness.
Arden, this is a city where it's hard to tell how sane people are. Obviously, you have people walking on the street who seem to be talking to themselves, but they're talking on their phones. How do we know when people are entering the jail system whether they are mentally ill or not? And how do we know what kind of services they need? And to make this question even more difficult, how do we know to make sure they get those services?
When someone enters the jail system, when they go through an intake process, and during that process, they're assessed for mental illness by a clinician from Correctional Health Services. And that is in part because in 2003, the city settled a case, Brad H. versus City of New York, that requires people who are living with a mental illness to be provided with services, discharge planning services. And so to ensure that the jails are providing those, or they know who to provide the services for, we see in the data that we receive from the Department of Correction a marker, what they call a Brad H marker, that lets us sort of see whether sort of a person associated with a given stay is living with a mental illness and therefore would be eligible for those discharge planning services.
If I were arrested and going to jail, what would you ask me, or how would you know whether I was mentally ill?
So I don't know that, personally, but that's certainly something that the clinicians at Correctional Health Services are assessing for. My understanding is that involves sort of the person's current physical and, mental state, as well as sort of any medications they may be taking or report taking.
Jan, do you know the answer to that question? I mean, if I were brought into the system, how would anyone tell whether I was obviously anxious or aggravated because of the arrest itself, or whether I was certifiably mentally ill?
Yeah, there's supposed to be a number of steps taken. Once you enter the jail system, you are immediately seen by a doctor and a mental health provider, and they ask a series of questions at the intake process. They ask if you have any previous psychiatric medication, if you've ever been hospitalized for a psychiatric matter. And in that process, they're supposed to sort of try to figure out who needs mental health services or not. They can also check a database that is sort of shared with a lot of health professionals to see if you've had any recent hospitalizations. And so even if you are someone who, you are in denial about your mental health needs, that's sort of like the back channel way that the officials there can figure out who needs services. But even sometimes those steps don't necessarily work the way that they should.
Arden, the IBO, the Independent Budget Office, came out with a recent report about the changing demographics of the jail population in New York City. What does that show?
Yeah, so quite a lot of things. So first, I do just want to sort of maybe give a couple of definitions to make sure we're on the same page. First, that we were talking about city jails and not prisons,
right?
Which is, a distinction. Essentially, most of the people in jails are pre-trial, and a small number of people are serving sentences of
Although
less than
they stay there a pretty long time.
They do. So that is among our findings. So sort of our highest level findings, the number of stays at city jail, so distinct from the number of people, because someone could come in to the system multiple times in a given year, is down 73% from 2014. So we looked at 2014 through 2023. So that's 77,000 stays down to about 21,000 stays. And then at the same time, the average length of those stays has increased from 55 days to 105 days. But one of the reasons we wanted to take a look at the population and how it's changing and the impact on length of stay is because length of stay is such a widely reported statistic. And we wanted to provide a little bit of nuance and see how the changing jail population, which we see did change quite a lot during this decade, might be impacting that sort of single statistic.
And what have you found?
So there are two groups that we really focus on, in part because they both have longer average lengths of stay, sort of compared to their compared to other people, and then also because they make up a larger share of the jail population than they did previously. So stays for violent felony charges, for example, we see the share of that. Those stays goes from 17% of stays in 2014 to 46% of stays in 2023. And those stays, again, are much longer than stays for a charge like a misdemeanor. The other population that we looked at was people living with a mental illness. Based on that sort of Brad H marker in the data, we were able to see that sort of stays associated with someone living with a mental illness are almost twice, or actually more than twice as long as stays by someone without a mental illness. And that actually has been true since 2014. However, the average length of stay for people with a mental illness has increased to more than 140 days.
Does that mean they're there because we don't know what else to do with them, or because they're actually getting treated and helped?
We didn't look into in the report exactly why someone might be in jail versus sort of awaiting trial in the community. But there are sort of alternative to incarceration programs that do address mental illness and are designed to support that population, for example, mental health courts. So we weren't able to look at why someone was in jail versus why they, as opposed to being in one of those programs. But it's a great question, something we're interested in.
Jan, New Yorkers, many New Yorkers at least, are scared on the subways, on the streets, about people who are mentally ill and violent. A lot of people are mentally ill and not violent, of course. Are there adequate facilities as an alternative to prison, to jail, for those people?
I think the short answer is that there is a whole system that is supposed to be at play well before someone, ends up committing an offense while, in the throes of a mental health crisis and ends up in jail. But the state has not funded these programs in the way that it should for many, many years. And so there are, a number of outpatient treatment teams that are supposed to, target this particular population of people who are among the hardest to treat. And these are, the folks that you see on the subway system. They are homeless, they are severely mentally ill, and often not medication compliant. But there are a number of various treatment teams that, include clinicians, peer specialists, psychiatrists, nurses, who can meet people where they're at and provide medication and psychiatric services. But, these programs have been underfunded since deinstitutionalization. And so I think what we're seeing today with the jails filling up with people who are mentally ill is a result of that.
How do we assess the impact of Kendras Law? The Times investigation not that long ago by Jan and Amy Julia Harris found a mixed bag on that. What did the IBO find?
So the IBO hasn't looked at Kendras Law specifically, and we would need to think about whether, so we have access sort of as per the charter to data from city agencies. So we would need to think about whether or not the data that we have access to would really be able to speak to that specifically. But one thing I did want to sort of add on to what Jan was saying is that sort of the alternative to incarceration programs that I mentioned, including those for people with mental illnesses, we did see in the last two budget cycles at November and January, actually reductions, budget reductions for alternative to incarceration programs, including things like supervised release, which has been very heavily utilized post-bail reform. So the question of funding is certainly a good question.
Jen, how do we reconcile protecting civil liberties and protecting public safety at the same time? Obviously, both important issues going beyond philosophical questions, of course, but something we've struggled with for a long time.
I think you're right. I mean, I think every mayor administration has sort of had to contend with this, particularly since that, the mental health crisis has not ever gone away. I mean, there is an option, of course, for involuntary commitment, but it's usually the option of last resort. It's not something that doctors want to use lightly, and it's typically only used when someone is considered to be a danger to themselves or others. As I said earlier, these other sort of parts of the system were designed to keep people out in the community, right? When we talk about deinstitutionalization, this happened because there were state psych centers that were basically places of abuse and neglect. And so, the thinking was that if you treat people out in the community, that it would be better, right? That they would have more freedom and more rights. But ultimately, the funding has not been there, the support has not been there for the workers. And so, this is kind of where we're at.
So can anything work without some form of involuntary commitment?
Yeah, I think we've seen that, right? I mean, when we talk about Kendras Law, it mostly works, right? Like there are instances, of course, which we've reported where it has broken down, and a lot of those breakdowns were in preventable ways. But, we've seen programs like Kendras Law. We've seen, treatment teams like the ACT team or the IMT teams that, support people and help them to continue to get treatment in the community. So it definitely can work. I think the city and state has to ensure that it does.
Jan Ransom of the New York Times and Arden Armbruster of the Independent Budget Office, thanks to both of you for joining us. Coming up next, we'll get to the root of Eric Adams' mayoral collapse. It's been just a little over 2 years since Eric Adams became mayor. In that short time, he's faced some seemingly insurmountable challenges and controversies. Where did it all go wrong for him? Writing for The Atlantic, my former New York Times colleague Michael Powell examined the mayor who was filled with promise and is now facing some brutal realities. Was it a collapse or just bad luck? Well, what do you think, Michael Powell? Is the mayor getting a bum rap or not?
Look, he has some clear challenges, right? I mean, particularly the migrant crisis, which has just brought tens of thousands of migrants. They've had to figure out how to, house, clothe, feed, all of that sort of thing. Not to mention, kind of the, if you will, the kind of disruption of the culture, of the social fabric of the city. At the same time, every mayor faces some, greater or larger crises. And I think it's fair to say that, for instance, with the migrant one, that really appeared to rattle this mayor. I mean, he talked in almost apocalyptic terms about, the destruction of New York and this sort of thing. I think, certainly in retrospect, that is never a good look. I mean, they're, you know, mayors, Giuliani notably with 9/11, but I mean, it goes with every mayor. You're going to have these moments, and, you know, the kind of your force of personality and the ability you have to kind of convey, yeah, this is a problem. Yeah, we're getting hurt by whatever, the Fed's not doing enough stuff, but we're going to get through this. And I think that hurt the mayor.
And he certainly has also had to confront the aftermath of COVID with remote working and Midtown sort of emptying out, although certainly signs are coming back and signs of improving employment. But how much of either of those things are his responsibility? Is this a question of optics or a question of substance in both cases? Is there, what more could he have been doing?
Right, and I think that no, it's a really fair question. For instance, with the changes in work. I mean, look, these are nationwide phenomenon right now, even global phenomenon right now. And so, you know, his ability by, you know, sort of using his bully pulpit to change that, I think, are pretty limited. And I think actually that's an area where he's been, I think, from the get-go, pretty good about saying, you know, we want to encourage people to get back. They're starting to do some interesting zoning work, converting some of the old office buildings into residential and stuff. So I think that that's an area where it strikes me, you know, as much as a mayor can affect that sort of thing, he's been working, he's doing what he can.
Every mayor, certainly every mayor I've covered, and I'm sure you too, has thought he's gotten, you know, a bum rap from the press. This mayor any more or less so than previous ones? And this mayor is at the overlay, as David Dinkins did, of blaming some of that on race, deservedly so or not?
I think on that, my sense would be not deservedly so. I don't think he's getting blamed.
Although he himself has sort of invoked the race card occasionally too.
Oh, he most certainly has, a number of times. And he likes to talk about his, you know, take pride in his chocolate, you know, as he puts it, inner circle, people of, you know, not just black, but...
And are we allowing the enslavers to rip us again? I mean, he has brought that out himself.
Yes, and there's an anger, as in that moment, which was at a mosque up in the Bronx, where you can feel his kind of anger and resentment and hurt kind of bubbling up in ways that are not helpful to him. And frankly, at that mosque that day, it was a West African mosque, and they were kind of perplexed by that. I mean, they were just mainly really happy to have the mayor there.
Is that tactical or emotional, or?
I think it's a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. I mean, look, that was a case, I think I was the only press there. So in that sense, he wasn't doing it for me.
Right.
So I think there it was emotional. There was just this sense of, you know, I'm not being treated well. I'm you know, somehow this is all falling on me. I mean, he has big challenges, including a much more left-leaning city council. But that city council, you know, if you want to talk in racial and ethnic terms, I mean, is transformed from the days that you or I would have covered that stuff back in the 80s and 90s. You know, I mean, it's a strikingly diverse group. And, you know, the differences with the mayor there, and I think he's struggling with that, are frankly more ideological and philosophical than they are questions of, you know, we're going to go after a black mayor. Why would they go after a black mayor? The Speaker of the Council is black. Mm-hmm. You know, many of the leading lights on the council are non-white. So it's a, you know, I think he's also struggling with a changing city, a city that's different. He's 63, so he's frankly around my age. And, you know, he's struggling, I think, with a city that looks, in many ways, looks ideologically and philosophically different than the city that he grew up in. He came of age in, say, in the 80s and 90s.
And worked in as a former cop.
And worked in as a cop, yes.
What's he doing wrong?
He has a hermetically sealed inner circle, which is not overly laden with talent.
This is something that Nicole Gelinas pointed out in an op-ed piece
yes,
in the New York
a very
Times
good
too,
one.
And talked about on this program.
Yes, and Nicole's piece was excellent. I think he relies on this very tight inner circle. He doesn't let in much oxygen. Some of his own commissioners have literally gone to like the portal to try to get in touch with the mayor or his top people, and that's never a good thing. I mean, if you think of some of the more successful mayors, Bloomberg being a good example, whatever one makes of his politics, I mean, he gave a fair amount of leeway. He appointed what he saw as good people, and then he gave them a lot of leeway. Some of the appointments have been good, some not so good for this mayor, but there's a real sense that he kind of holds power very closely.
This is micromanaging, including the police department and other agencies?
Yes, and he's never been, I mean, with respect to him, it doesn't mean he can't be a successful mayor, but he's never run anything of moment. I mean, the biggest thing he was Brooklyn Borough President, which is a toothless office. Not nothing.
Mostly ceremonial.
Mostly ceremonial. So I think that he's struggled with that, and it's kind of hard to point to smart top hands in the city that kind of that he listens to and that he's able to reach out to. And he's really mishandled, I think, the city council. Admittedly, a difficult task. He's kind of a center liberal politician. The council, the gravity is very much to the left there. But it's a strong mayor form of government, and he's gotten rolled by the council now several times, including on an issue like police that really matters to him.
Bill de Blasio was criticized for maybe not enjoying the job that much, for not working that hard. Is Mayor Adams getting a bum rap for nightlife?
Yeah, honestly I think, my tendency is to say whatever. I don't think anybody would argue that he doesn't show up at work early the next day. He doesn't, with all due respect to our former mayor, he doesn't drive out to, to Brooklyn to go to the gym. I mean, he seems to be a reasonably involved, as I say, sometimes too involved, too micromanaging. So I don't think that the nightlife per se gets to him. I mean, I think that's there may be fair questions to ask about some of the people he's hanging out with.
Yeah.
But the mere fact that he's out 10, 11, 12 at night, if he's showing up the next morning and he's holding his administration accountable, then who cares?
Vision is something that you and Nicole Gelinas both brought up, the lack of vision. But one of the things he has done is, as you mentioned, rezoning to make for greater density in the city, something a lot of neighborhoods have resisted, even though they want more affordable housing. And yet he seems to have accomplished this in ways that the prior administration hasn't. Isn't that worthy of some praise?
Yes. In short, I mean, I think that's been one of his better appointees, was at the Planning Commission, and I think and then look, if I'm going to say that the mayor holds things tight, then obviously he also deserves some credit if something worked. And I think that's a place where tentatively right now it looks like he's pushing the city in the right direction.
Very few incumbent mayors have lost for re-election. How does he stand 2 years from now, do you think?
I don't see him as doomed, but he's also, he's hurting. Look, he's being investigated by 2 U.S. attorneys, a district attorney, and the inspector general. I mean, he has real, genuine worries in that respect. I mean, and a lot of it's around, how he funded campaigns, favors that may or may not have been given to foreign governments. Those are real existential threats to him. Should any of those turn really grim on him, in other words, not just even if were he to get indicted, but if people around him were to get indicted, then there's blood in the water. Mm-hmm. Absent that, because that has not happened yet, absent that, it seems to me he retains a base, an electoral base, particularly, you know, he has support within the African American community. The polling does not suggest that's limitless. I mean, it suggests it's certainly shrunk. He has some support within the Latino community. He has some support within the Orthodox. I mean, the usual way that every politician of every color puts together their...
Especially if 10 people run against him.
Yes, precisely. So, and that's another thing, right? If there were one or two people and it quickly went down to one, I think he might be in trouble. He only got, I mean, he got very narrowly elected in the first place. So it's not as if he came in with a huge majority.
Thanks to my former New York Times colleague, Michael Powell. And coming up next, I'll have some thoughts on parking and congestion pricing. You know the old joke about the guy who walks into a bank and wants to borrow $5,000? When the loan officer asks for collateral, the guy hands him the keys to his pristine Ferrari. A week later, he returns the $5,000 plus $15 in interest. The banker thanks him, but is curious. "We checked your credit rating," the banker says, "and you're a millionaire. Why did you need to borrow $5,000? To which the borrower replies, "Where else could I park for a full week for $15? Parking in Manhattan has been a nightmare for decades. It's like musical chairs, Jerry Seinfeld once said, except everybody sat down around 1964. Now that the MTA has approved congestion pricing, those jokes may challenge your sense of humor, especially if you live north of 60th Street in Manhattan. Even if you're exempt from the toll or are granted a discount, parking is going to become more of a problem. Finding a free space will be more difficult. Getting one in a garage will cost you more. Several factors are squeezing the supply. All those double-parked vans delivering the stuff you ordered online. Pending city regulations to legalize post-pandemic sidewalk restaurants, most of which are not on the sidewalk but on the street, many displacing parking spaces. Containers for garbage. Competition for free parking will also grow because drivers from outside Manhattan will park north of 60th Street to avoid the toll and find their way downtown by some other means. If you stow your vehicle in a garage, be prepared to pay a lot more. If you live in Manhattan, maybe you can afford to, but the rates are doubling in some places. One garage on the east side that I know of just raised its monthly fee from $375 to $699. That's nearly half of what tenants pay for a one-bedroom apartment in a New York City public housing project. In his book, Paved Paradise, Henry Graeber quotes Donald Shoup, whom he calls America's foremost parking scholar. Quote, "Thinking about parking seems to take place in a reptilian cortex," Shoup says, the most primitive part of the brain, said to govern instinctive behavior involving aggression, dominance, territoriality, and ritual display. Now the question is whether making it harder to park might also make it easier not to drive, and whether that too will speed and reduce congestion. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.